please start. You're okay? Okay. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahanau Bhunaktu Sahavidyan Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om. Very good. Welcome back. Welcome also to the many students attending these classes online. We continue with our study of chapter 6 of this wonderful Uddhava Gita. The chapter, louder? You think so? I don't think so. I think it's loud enough. Is it loud enough? Yeah. Okay. Sorry. This chapter opened, as you remember, with Sri Krishna's discussion about the nature of bondage, bandha, and the nature of moksha, liberation. And we're not going to go back and repeat that part of the discussion, but as he goes on now, he shifts slightly. Instead of talking about bondage and liberation, he's talking about one who is bound and one who is liberated, which means what are the consequences of bondage? And that means the consequences of spiritual ignorance, the failure to recognize your own true nature, that divinity within. In Vedanta, we say, Satchidananda, Atma, that spiritual ignorance has consequences. What are those consequences? Sri Krishna will describe. And then for one who has gained moksha, liberation, one who has discovered the true self, what are the consequence, maybe not the right word, what are the blessings associated with that discovery? Okay, with that introduction, we can begin. Thank you. Indriyarteshu Gunarapi guneshu cha Grihyamaneshvaham kuryan navidwan yastva vikriyaha. Start at the end. Vidwan, and here Vidwan doesn't mean one who is scholarly or learned. It specifically means one who is enlightened. So Vidwan, the enlightened person, and we're in backwards, third line, Grihyamaneshu. When the enlightened person grasps, perceives, when he understands what? Now to the beginning. Indriyaihi indriyarteshu. Indriya, we translate it as senses, but the English word senses is a little too narrow because we only talk about our 5 senses, sight, hearing, taste, smell, and touch. Here, indriya has a broader meaning. It includes your powers of walking, talking, grasping, moving around. In fact, indriyas then refer to all of your faculties through which you participate in worldly activities. That's a nice way of understanding it. Indriyas in general are those faculties that you possess through which you engage in worldly activities. And the enlightened person knows indriyaihi indriyarteshu, that the faculties are engaged with objects of the faculties with objects in the world. That sounds a little bit unnecessary. The secret is in that second line, gunaihi api guneshu cha. A little obscure because I think it's assumed that you know the Bhagavad Gita verse this is based on. So in this text we find not exactly a restatement of Bhagavad Gita verses, but like paraphrases. And in chapter 3, Sri Krishna says, Tattva vittu mahabaho guna karma vibhaga yoho gunaguneshu vartante. Gunaguneshu var. Iti matva na sajjate. We studied this long ago in chapter 3, where Sri Krishna tells Arjuna that your faculties are engaged on their own in worldly activities. Guna guneshu vartante. So here, guna here refers to the reality because of which your faculties exist and the reality because of which the world exists. Now, this is a very sophisticated topic being taught here, but let's understand it in a very simple, direct way. You, and later in chapter 3, I think Sri Krishna says, Naiva kinchit karomiti. Sri Krishna says later, I don't do anything at all. And that's true not only for Sri Krishna, that's also true for the enlightened person. I don't do anything at all, but rather, as the first two lines say, the enlightened person understands these faculties are engaged in worldly activities, not me, not consciousness. Consciousness is the sakshi, the awareful witness. And that's where the verse ends. We'll come to that in a minute. Let's make sure we get this a little bit concretely. I have to give this example. And that is, right now, I'm not teaching. I'm not talking. I'm not thinking. I'm not seeing. I'm not hearing. Why? Because the mind is thinking. The ears are hearing. The mouth is talking, probably too much. On and on and on and on. Anyway, you get the point. All of these faculties are engaged in this worldly activity called teaching, but consciousness, which is my essential nature, is not at all engaged in that activity. That's what Sri Krishna means to say here. In fact, he says it, but in his rather obscure way with this reference to the Bhagavad Gita verse. So he says, the enlightened one knows that these faculties are engaged in worldly activities, but the enlightened person, again at the bottom, vidwan na aham kuryan. The vidwan na aham kuryat, breaking the words apart properly. The enlightened person does not identify. You see the root of the word ahankara here? So we're talking about identification. The enlightened person does not identify with the body, mind, senses, and other faculties. The wise one knows, as I just described, I'm not teaching. And it's not a big deal. I'm not teaching. Thank goodness this body and mind are well enough trained to go on teaching. And that's a great blessing of Ishvara, a great blessing of my Guru. With those blessings, this body and mind continues to be engaged in these worldly activities like teaching. And as pure consciousness, I don't do anything at all. Sakshi, observer. I observe that my mind is thinking. I observe that my mouth is talking. I observe that my ears are hearing and my eyes are seeing. This is a perspective of the Vidwan, the enlightened person. Yaha, in the last line finishing now, Yaha, the one who is, breaking the words, Yaha tu avikriyaha. Tu, but this enlightened person is Yaha, one who is avikriya, unchanging. Now, in order to be engaged in worldly activities, something has to happen. Some kind of inner change, some kind of, at least, change of position of your bodily limbs. So here, avikriya refers to the fact that the enlightened person has shifted his or her identification away from the body and mind and towards consciousness. Notice that we keep talking about destruction of ego, destruction of ignorance, but here that word destruction is perhaps a little unhelpful. How about this? In fact, in colloquial English, we talk about a shift of consciousness. Now, that's in colloquial English. In Vedanta, consciousness can't shift. Consciousness is all-pervasive. How can that which is all-pervasive shift? So when we use that American expression, shift of consciousness, we're talking about a shift of understanding, right? So what is that shift of understanding? It is shifting your identification from the body and mind to your true nature as Satchidananda Atma. Now, you already understand through these teachings that your essential nature is Satchidananda Atma. You've understood that already. None of you have failed to understand this. You've heard it again and again and again. That's not the problem. The problem is the identification continues. You understand, but that identification lingers. And here's a good way to explore this. Just very briefly, then we'll go on to the next verse. How about this? If you ask yourself, who am I? What is your first answer? It'll be different for different people, right? Kind of depending on your activities. So if you are in the midst of raising a family, you might say, I am a mother, I am father. If you are deeply involved in professional activities, you might say, I am a doctor, I am this, I am that. So it depends, right? And then, of course, later you'll say, yeah, and then also my true nature is Satchidananda Atma. But that doesn't come first, does it? It's there. It's absolutely there. It just doesn't come first. So the disidentification we're after is when I am Satchidananda Atma is the first answer to the question, who am I? It comes. It just takes time to shift. They say shift consciousness. It's shifting our thinking, shifting which is so habitual. So it takes time and effort to bring about this change in our conclusions, and in particular, it takes time to break this identification with the body and mind and re-establish your identification as being Satchidananda Atma. Not re-establish, because that suggests you had it before. You didn't have it before. So to establish your identification, I am unchanging consciousness. Avikriya, unchanging. And that which is unchanging cannot be involved in any kind of activity. You might remember some classes ago, we talked about healthy detachment. I don't want to go through all those discussions, but that's our topic here. Okay, let us continue. Daivadhine shariresmin, Daivadhine shariresmin, Guna bhavyena karmana, Guna bhavyena karmana, Vartamano buddhastatra, Vartamano buddhastatra, Kartasmiti nibadhyate, Kartasmiti nibadhyate. So in the previous verse, Sri Krishna described the vidwan, the wise person. Now he's describing the one who is otherwise. Wise? Otherwise. And who is that otherwise person? In the third line, he is abuddha. He is not knowledgeable. Here, Buddha, not Buddha, Buddha. Little tricky, right? So Buddha is one who is one who, literally one who has awakened is Buddha. Unless we're in America, which we are, in which case Buddha becomes Buddha. How many American spiritual practitioners are following the teachings of Buddha? Okay, good for them. Nice. Anyway, here the word is not Buddha, but rather Buddha. A Buddha, one who is not wise, one who is not knowledgeable, and in particular, one who is not enlightened. That's the context. So one who is not enlightened, vartamanaha, being engaged in what? Go up one line, karmana. Being engaged in various activities which are guna bhavyena, which are driven by gunas. In particular, rajas. And when we say driven by, guna bhavya, created by, driven by gunas, we've discussed so many times how we are driven by raga and dvesha. Raga, the compulsion to get what you want. Dvesha, the compulsion to run away from what you don't want. This raga, dvesha is absolutely the result not just of rajas, but also of tamas, both. Why tamas? Interesting, because you think raga, dvesha, compulsion seems very rajasic, and it is. But if there's no tamas, that won't exist. Tamas refers to the so-called darkness of ignorance, the veil of ignorance that prevents you from recognizing your true nature as pure consciousness, full and complete. Failing to recognize your innate divinity, your innate fullness, your innate perfection, your innate completeness, failing to recognize that, then raga and dvesha arise. So you see how tamas is involved? Tamas in the sense of ignorance. Due to non-recognition of your true nature, then raga and dvesha arise. So therefore, that the unenlightened person is engaged in various karmas, actions, activities, which are guna bhavyena, driven by gunas, in particular driven by raga, dvesha. And those activities take place where, top line, asmin sharire, in this body. And interesting adjective he adds here. In this body, which is daiva adhine. In this body, which is adhina, subject to daiva. Daiva is used as a technical word when we talk about the doctrine of karma, to talk about the fructification of past karmas. So daiva adhine means in a body which is subject to karma. Who's in control? This is just a fact of life. We like to think we're in control of our bodies, and we do the best we can. We try to eat good food, try to get exercise, we go to the doctor for checkups, whatever we do. If we have some problem, physical problem, we deal with that. So being engaged in all these activities, taking care of our physical bodies, can lead us into the delusion that we are in control. And all it takes is a moment's reflection to understand how untrue that is. We don't know. What will happen to our bodies tomorrow? What will happen to our bodies this afternoon? we don't know. That is due to the fructification of karma. So, being associated with these bodies, which are not as reliable as you might think, the unenlightened person is constantly driven by raga dvesha to chase after what looks good and run away from that which doesn't look good. And finally, tatra, back on the third line, tatra, with regard to this, the unenlightened person, karta asmi iti. The enlightened person says, I am the agent of action. And this, according to Sri Krishna, nibadhyate, is what causes bondage. Now, this needs to be understood properly. How can karta asmi is a statement of identification? In what sense does identification with your body and mind cause bondage? This is a very good question. How? How does that work? First of all, bondage, even bondage to what? And the conventional answer, which is unhelpful, is to say bondage to continued birth and rebirth, the cycle of rebirth. Well, we're going to see, actually later in class, I hope we get there, we're going to see that Sri Krishna is not talking about what happens in your next life. Sri Krishna is talking about bondage that exists now. Bondage that affects you now. What kind of bondage is he talking about? We've just referred to that. Raga and, in fact, three things. Raga and dvesha, and then being daiva adhina. These are three kinds of bondage. One is raga, when you know you're not supposed to eat that cake in the in the refrigerator, and you eat it anyway. Dvesha, when you don't want to take a medicine that your doctor has prescribed, and so you avoid taking that medicine, that's dvesha. When you go for that cake in the refrigerator, who's driving? Is it that you figured out, I deserve this cake, I should eat this cake? You know you shouldn't eat the cake. Who's in control? You or your desires? So not being in control is a kind of bondage, is it not? When you're in jail, a typical idea of bondage, if you are in jail or in shackles, you are restricted, you are confined, you are not free to do what you want. You are driven. You are compelled. So bringing us back to this idea of raga being a kind of bondage, dvesha being another kind of bondage, and being stuck with these bodies over which we do not have complete control is another kind of bondage. You're not in control. We're not free to ensure that our bodies are always healthy. These are kinds of bondage in particular. And here's a Vedantic definition of bondage. Bondage in the worldly sense is bondage to a life of suffering. That's what we mean. Not in any other sense, but being stuck, being trapped, being confined to a life of suffering. And what makes the suffering? Raga, dvesha, karma, other things also. So this causes suffering, and all of this suffering exists because kartasmi, the unenlightened person says, I am the agent of action. That's a statement of identification with the body and mind. Now, you've all heard this topic, and perhaps you heard this long ago and it sounded so abstract. You are identified with your body and mind. You have to disidentify with the body and mind. You are Satchidananda Atma. Now, perhaps you can see that's not so abstract. That's a reality. The reality is your identification with the body and mind is the source of suffering. And conversely, a healthy detachment from your body and mind is what frees you from that suffering. That word healthy detachment we discussed long ago. It means you don't ignore your body and mind, you don't become blind to your body and mind, but you attain a very pragmatic attitude. When the body is hungry, let it eat. When the body is thirsty, let it drink. That kind of pragmatic attitude. Okay. Nabhadyate. Bondage is then due to identification. Continuing. Evam virakta shayana. Evam virakta shayana. Asanatana majjane. Asanatana majjane. Darshana sparshana krana, darshana sparshana grana, bhojana shravanadishu, bhojana shravanadishu. This is the first part of a sentence that we'll see concluded in the next verse. But let's just go through this. Quite simple. It says, evam viraktaha. One who is evam, thus virakta. And we'll translate it here as detached or disidentified. One who has healthy disidentification, healthy detachment. And that person has healthy detachment in all situations. I'm smiling right now because I still remember as a young student sitting in front of my guru and feeling so blissfully detached until class was over. So I mean, because when you're with your guru, you can get that bhava, that feeling, And I definitely had that feeling, but that feeling, unfortunately, in those early days, went away. Here, Sri Krishna is describing the person as having this healthy detachment or disidentification with body and mind in all situations. Like what? Shayane. The A drops due to grammar rules. Shayane. While you're laying down in bed, detached. while you are asana, while you're sitting, detached. What that detached means is my body lays. My body is sitting. I am not sitting. This is basic, but it's so important. My body sits, I don't sit. Atana is walking. So my body walks, I don't walk. Majjana is bathing. My body is bathed, I don't get bathed. Consciousness gets bathed? You can't, it doesn't make sense. Darshana is seeing. My eyes see. Sparshana, touching. My skin touches, feels. Grana, my nose smells. Bhojana, my mouth eats. How's that? Shravana, my ears hear. So this is just clear thinking. You are the witness of the activities of your faculties. These are all indriyas, which we described before, not as senses, but in a more general sense as faculties. Your faculties right now are fully engaged. You're looking at me, you're hearing me, you're thinking about what we're doing, what we're discussing. So your faculties are engaged. Are you aware that your faculties are engaged? And suppose you get distracted. By the way, if you pull out your cell phone, I see that. Rarely does that happen. But anyway, my point is, when you're paying attention, you know you're paying attention, and when you're distracted, you know you're distracted. You are the awareful observer of paying attention. You are the awareful observer of being distracted. You are that sakshi, observer, witness, who is avikriya, the word Sri Krishna used in the last verse, unchanging consciousness. You are the witness who is not engaged. All of these indriyas are engaged, faculties are engaged. Consciousness is disengaged as the observer, the awareful witness. Let's see the last part of the sentence. Natata badhyate vidwan, natata badhyate vidwan, tatra tatradayan gunan, tatra tatradayan gunan, prakritistopya samsakto, prakritistopya samsakto, yathakam savita nilaha, yathakam savita nilaha. Na tata badhyate vidwan. The vidwan, again, not a scholarly person, but rather one who is enlightened. The enlightened person, na badhyate, is not bound tata, like that, like the other one, like the one who is otherwise, that one. Not the wise, the otherwise. The wise one is not born, is not bound, like the otherwise. Why? Tatra tatra adayan gunan. And here guna again refers to the faculties. Faculties are based, everything in the world is based on, everything that exists in the material world is based on gunas. You've heard me say before that just as in modern science, we look at the world in terms of matter and energy. In ancient times, they looked at the universe through the lens of these three gunas, sattva, rajas, tamas. So which means your faculties are made of gunas, and they are engaging with the world, which is made of gunas. We saw that in the previous verse. So The enlightened person is one, tatra tatra, with regard to each of those faculties. What are those faculties in the prior verse? Seeing, walking, talking, smelling, eating, hearing, etc. All of those faculties, adayan, the enlightened person attributes, adayan, he or she attributes gunan, to the qualities, to the gunas. Meaning, the enlightened person attributes the activities of the faculties, seeing, hearing, etc., to the body and mind without identification. It's another way of describing how the enlightened person is not identified. There are two ways of describing this lack of identification. One is what I am not. I am not the body, I am not the mind, I am not the one who thinks, better yet, I am not the thinker, I am not the hearer, I am not the talker, etc. So part of it is disidentification, part of it is identification. I am pure consciousness. So that person, that enlightened person in the third line is end of the third line, asamsaktaha. That's a lovely word in Sanskrit. Sakta, attached. Samsakta. There's an American expression when you are sucked in. You know that expression? When you're sucked in, samsakta. Yeah, that's exactly the sense of it in Sanskrit, samsakta. You are sucked in. There's some problem at home or some problem at work, and you get completely sucked in to that problem, samsakta. But the enlightened person is samsakta. Importantly, prakritistaha, api, even though the enlightened person is prakritistaha, abiding prakriti, in this world of nature, the one who is present in the world but not sucked in. Can you imagine? You all know what it's like to be in a big argument with three people, okay? This is a three-people argument, three-person argument. So, and you are one of the arguers, and you're getting all heated up and fired up, and everyone, you know what this is about. Suppose you are asamsakta, and you watch the other two. Watch them duke it out, fight with each other, curse each other, and all of this stuff. And you just watch. And it's interesting, when you are asamsakta in such a situation, you just see how silly it is to be sucked in to those arguments. So imagine being able to avoid being sucked in to any situation whatsoever, which means to have a healthy detachment so that you maintain a clear mind, you maintain your objectivity. You know what happens. As soon as you get sucked into that argument, emotions take over, right? When you get sucked into any situation, emotions take over. Suppose you could be in those very demanding, challenging situations without being sucked in. Healthy detachment. And that healthy detachment, Sri Krishna describes so beautifully here. He gives 3 examples. He says that healthy detachment is like yatha kam, like space. Space is unaffected. Very appropriate nowadays. We pump all this pollution and carbon dioxide into the air, but space remains utterly unaffected. In ancient times, they would use a metaphor of smoke. Space isn't affected by smoke. In the same way, your true nature, as Satchidananda Atma, is not affected by anything whatsoever. It is utterly detached, utterly non-separate from your body and mind. He gives another example, yatha savita. Excuse me, sorry. Like the sun. The sun shines. You've heard me give this example many times. The sun shines on a pool of filth and doesn't become defiled. The sun shines on a sacred temple and doesn't become more holy. The sun is unaffected by what it shines upon. Your consciousness is like that sun. We're talking about detachment, disidentification. And the third example is a little different. Yatha anilaha. Anila here means air, wind. And the idea of wind here, it's interesting, a little different from the other two expressions. Wind, you could say, wind is affected. Yeah, but wind has a certain kind of freedom. Wind can blow any direction it wants. Wind can change its direction in any moment. Wind has that kind of freedom. Wind is liberated from being controlled, liberated from bondage is the metaphor here. All of this refers to your essential nature as unchanging consciousness, that sakshi, a wareful witness, disengaged. All right, next. Vaishadhyekshaya sangha, Vaishadhyekshaya sangha, Shitaya chinna samshaya, Shitaya chinna samshaya, Pratibadhahiva swapnan, Pratibadhahiva swapnan, Nanatvad vinivartate, Nanatvad vinivartate. End of the second line. Let me introduce this a little bit. How can you gain this degree of detachment so that you can be in these really complicated, messy situations without being sucked in? How? And Sri Krishna explains how here. He says, when you are chinna samshayaha. Literally it means one whose samshaya, doubts, are chinna, removed. But here, in this context, one whose identification has been removed. We're not talking about doubts. We're talking about identification with your body and mind. So, one whose identification is chinna, severed. And this is also a reference to an Upanishad, which talks about the acts of detachment. Very nice expression. The so-called acts of detachment, that acts is your intellect. How do you discover that you are utterly separate from your body and mind and that you are truly unchanging consciousness? All of this is discovered through your intellect. So let us call your intellect the acts of detachment. Your intellect, better yet, your intellect wields the acts of detachment. Of course, axes can be dull. I don't know if any of you have used an axe, but if you can imagine, if you use a dull axe, if you're trying to chop up some wood, and your axe is dull, it's not going to work very well. In the same way, if your axe of detachment is dull, your mind is dull, your intellect is dull, then that won't be very helpful. So therefore, your axe of detachment, should be shita. It should be sharpened. So shataya, with a sharpened axe, and he makes it very clear. Asanga shita. How is that axe of attachment, your mind, axe of detachment, your mind, how is it sharpened? Through asanga shataya. Asanga shastrena dirdena chatva. So I'm confusing the Bhagavad Gita verse with this verse. So with your asanga, with your detachment sharpened. Asanga, opposite of sanga, opposite of asamsakta. Opposite of samsakta. You can tell I'm getting a little dizzy right now. Anyway, we'll finish up this verse and then call it quits for today. So, one whose buddhi has its disidentification sharpened. Sharp disidentification. And here, Sri Krishna describes it in the first line as Vaisharadya Ikshaya. With Iksha here means seeing, perception, understanding. With understanding, that is Vaisharadya, skillful understanding. That's what these classes are about. In order to make our minds sharp enough to successfully disidentify with the body and mind, it requires Vaisharadya, skill. That's what these teachings are about. That's what this text is about. So, for one whose I'll paraphrase the first half, for one whose identification with the body and mind has been removed through a sharpened sense of detachment, when the intellect becomes sufficiently skillful, then what? In the last half, pratibuddhaha iva swapnat. And this is Buddha, not Buddha, we saw before. This is Buddha. Unless you're in America, Buddha. Okay, enough of that joke. Here, pratibuddha means awakened. Pratibuddha eva, like one who is awakened, swapnat, from a dream. When you wake up from a dream, in a dream, you are identified with a body. Not the body laying in your bed, right? When you're dreaming, you're not identified with the body laying in your bed. You're identified with the body you projected into your dream. You are generally a character in your own dreams. So that dreamer has a body, and you are identified with that body in a dream. And an elephant, of course, is chasing you in the dream and is about to crush you in that dream. And then you wake up. And all of the fear and suffering of the dream instantly go away. Why? You no longer are identified with that dream body. Now, this is a perfect place to bring in this modern metaphor I think you've heard me use before. To me, a great metaphor for enlightenment is what we call today a lucid dream. Suppose, and a lucid dream means you're dreaming and you know you're dreaming. And as I mentioned in another, I think it was actually in the Upadesha Sastri class, I mentioned that I have never seen a reference to lucid dreaming in any scripture, but it is a brilliant metaphor. We understand lucid dreaming today as being dreaming, a state of dreaming and knowing it's a dream. So imagine if you're having a lucid dream of being chased by an elephant. What would that be like? You know it's a dream, and you know that this body is a dream body, it's not real. You know that the elephant is not real, and you know if the elephant catches you, nothing was really going to happen because it's all a dream. Excellent metaphor for enlightenment. You experience it, but you know it's not real. It's not as real as you. And this is a vision of an enlightened person. You experience it, but it's not. To say it's not real doesn't give you the right sense. Not as real as you. Body is not as real as you. And anything that's not as real as you can't hurt you, right? The elephant is not as real as the one laying in bed. What can that elephant do to you? Nothing. The elephant is less real. Your body is less real. Therefore, the illness of the body can't harm you in any way because it's less real. Let's have fun with this just for a moment. Your boss at work, when he's in a bad mood, can't hurt you at all because he's not as real as you. You being unchanging consciousness. That boss can fire the worker. That boss cannot fire unchanging consciousness. You get the point. So this is what it is to be free from suffering in life, and Sri Krishna gives us a lovely metaphor, like one who wakes up from a dream, the enlightened person, nana twat vinivartate. The enlightened person turns away from nana twat duality. Just as when you, brilliant, this metaphor has been used many times in scriptures. Waking up from a dream is often used as a metaphor for enlightenment. And the reason it's used as a metaphor for enlightenment is while you're dreaming, you take everything as absolutely real. When you wake up from the dream, only then, set that lucid dream metaphor aside. This is more scriptural, not lucid dream. So while you're dreaming, your dream world seems absolutely real. And you take everything very seriously. You take that elephant very seriously until you wake up and you know it's not real. Suppose you wake up out of the sleep of ignorance, so to speak, the metaphor. You wake up out of the sleep of ignorance and you recognize that all this is not as real as you thought it was. In the dream, you took the elephant very seriously. In the waking state, you took all this very seriously until you wake up out of the dream of ignorance. It's a brilliant metaphor. Okay, that's a good place to conclude. Some announcements. Again, I'm sorry we had no programs last weekend. I have this vertigo problem, and if I'm too dizzy, I just can't teach. For this reason, I want to make this announcement again. I request you, before you come for class, check your email for any last-minute cancellation announcement. Sometimes I don't know till I wake up that I'm too dizzy to teach. So please check your email. And of course, if you haven't signed up for those program announcement emails, it's a good thing to do. Then you'll be informed. Other announcements are today we have our Samashraya support group. It's a support group for caregivers of people undergoing mental illness of any kind. So if you are a caregiver like that, please come at 4 p.m. for the support group. And then tomorrow, Sunday, I'm happy to tell you that we're returning to our original schedule. We tried several things, and whatever we tried didn't seem to work very well, including trying to live stream our satsangs. It just doesn't work. It's too much of a distraction. So we're going back to our original Sunday schedule. That schedule is 10 a.m. Upadesha Sahasri, this brilliant text of Shankara. So it's our Vedanta class at 10 a.m., followed at 11 a.m. with satsang. The only thing that's changed is instead of meeting for Vedanta class and satsang here, we're going to meet in the small hall next door here. Otherwise, it'll be the same as well. Oh, also let me mention that in the Upadesha Sahasri class, we begin a new chapter. So if you haven't been attending, this is a great time to begin. You're right at the beginning of the chapter. And each chapter is completely independent. It's like 18 little texts. Actually, not all of them are little. Some chapters are quite big. But every chapter is independent. So if you would like to join that class, this would be an excellent time. So again, 10 o'clock is the Vedanta class, followed by 11 o'clock satsang. We'll conclude with our brief prayers.